The year is 1415. Europe is a continent of conflict. A long and bitter struggle rages between two great kingdoms. This is the 100 Years' War. England and France have been locked in a brutal dance of death for decades. Kings have come and gone. Fortunes have been won and lost. But the core dispute remains unresolved. The English crown lays claim to the throne of France itself. It is a claim born of blood, marriage, ambition. For generations, this ambition has fueled relentless warfare, draining treasuries and costing countless lives. It is a conflict that has defined an era, a seemingly endless cycle of sieges, raids, broken truces. Into this cauldron of chaos steps a new English king. He is young, ambitious, utterly ruthless. His name is Henry V. Henry is no stranger to the battlefield. He is a hardened warrior. He carries the scars of war on his own face. Now he turns his gaze across the English Channel. He sees a France weakened by internal division. A mad king sits on the French throne, his kingdom fractured by the bitter rivalries of powerful nobles. For Henry, this is not a crisis. It is an opportunity, a divine signal. In August 1415, Henry V launched his great enterprise. He gathered a vast fleet, a force of some 1,500 ships. It was an armada unlike any seen in generations. On board was an army of around 12,000 men, knights, men-at-arms, longbowmen. They sailed from Southampton, their destination the coast of Normandy. Their target was the vital port city of Harfleur. Henry's plan was audacious. He would seize Harfleur. From there, he would march, conquer, and force the French to their knees. The invasion began with a brutal siege. Harfleur was a tough nut to crack. For 5 long weeks, they battered the city walls with cannon fire. But the siege took a terrible toll. Disease, particularly dysentery, tore through the English camp. It was a more deadly enemy than any French soldier. By the time Harfleur finally surrendered, Henry's army was a shadow of its former self. His great invasion was on the verge of becoming a complete disaster. With his army ravaged by disease, Henry V faced a critical choice. The safe option was to sail home. But Henry was not a man who settled for modest victories. He was a gambler. He made a fateful decision. He would not retreat. Instead, he would march his beleaguered army overland, 150 miles north, to the English-held port of Calais. It was a defiant gesture, a march of defiance through the heart of enemy territory. The march quickly turned into a nightmare. The English were weak, hungry, exhausted. French forces shadowed their every move. The planned route across the River Somme was blocked, forcing Henry's men on a long, desperate detour inland. Every day the French army grew stronger, gathering a massive host to crush the impudent English invader once and for all. The English army was being herded. They were walking into a trap, outnumbered, exhausted, trapped. The English should have lost. A colossal French force, perhaps 5 times the size of Henry's army, blocked the road to Calais. There was no escape, but one weapon turned the tide of history. It was a simple piece of yew wood, 6 feet long, the English longbow. As torrential rain fell, turning the plowed fields into a quagmire of thick, clinging mud, the stage was set for a legendary confrontation. The next morning, on St. Crispin's Day, this small band of brothers would face their destiny. While the English suffered, France awakened. The internal squabbles were momentarily forgotten. Armagnac and Burgundy now found a common enemy. A call to arms echoed across the kingdom. From their magnificent castles, the great lords mustered their retainers. This was the flower of French chivalry, knights and men-at-arms. They were elite warriors, bred for battle and eager for glory. The French numbers swelled with incredible speed. Charles d'Albret and Marshal Boucicaut took charge. Each duke brought his own army. The French commanders watched Henry's desperate march with cold calculation. They shadowed him, blocked his path, and waited for the perfect moment to strike. The nobility, brimming with arrogance, saw victory as certain. They argued not if they'd win, but how they'd divide the spoils after the inevitable slaughter. The dawn of October 25th, 1415, broke cold and gray. The battlefield was a scene of utter desolation. This terrain would become a crucial factor. The narrowness of the field meant the vast French numbers could not be brought to bear all at once. It was a natural funnel, a killing ground in the making. The ground itself was the enemy. It was a sea of thick, sticky, ankle-deep mud. For a man encased in heavy plate armor, it would be a death sentence. Henry V was a shrewd tactician. He positioned his small army with meticulous care. His men-at-arms formed a thin line in the center, but the real strength lay on the flanks. To protect his vulnerable archers, Henry ordered them to prepare a final, ingenious defense. Each longbowman was to take a sharpened wooden stake and plant it in the ground in front of him. It was a deadly barrier, designed to impale charging horses. The English line was now a fortress of wood and steel, waiting for the inevitable French assault. Across the muddy expanse, the French army was a breathtaking spectacle of power and wealth. Knights and men-at-arms were encased from head to toe in magnificent, gleaming plate armor. It was also incredibly heavy. It was the armor of champions, but it was not made for a battle in the mud. Confidence radiated from the French lines. They looked across the field at the tiny, bedraggled English army and saw only a collection of peasants. The only question was, who would get the honor of striking the first blow? They decided to launch a massive frontal assault. They arranged themselves into 3 massive divisions. The first division alone contained more men than the entire English army. Their greatest strengths, their numbers and their heavy armor, were about to become their greatest weaknesses. Arrogance had blinded them. As the two armies faced each other, a tense quiet descended over the field. The hours ticked by. The French seemed in no hurry to begin the slaughter. For the English, this waiting was a form of torture. They checked their bowstrings. They planted their stakes. They said their prayers. Legend says he rode the lines, speaking as one of them. He reminded them they fought, not just for him, but for their homes, for their honor, for each other. After 3 long hours, Henry acted. He gave the order, advance. They picked up their protective stakes, moved forward into longbow range, and planted them again. The English had thrown down the gauntlet. The battle for Agincourt was about to begin. Henry V. Now strike. Narrator. V.O. The command was given. Now strike. Along the English line, 5,000 longbowmen acted as one. Narrator. V.O. The bowstrings sang their deadly song. Then the sky itself seemed to fall. The first volley of English arrows was on its way. Narrator. V.O. Up to 50,000 arrows in a single minute. The arrows came down not from the front, but almost vertically from above. They rained down upon them like a lethal hailstorm. Narrator. V.O. The impact was devastating. The thin plate armor offered little protection against the bodkin points. Knights who had expected a glorious charge were struck down. Narrator. V.O. Before the French could even process the first shock, the second volley was already in the air, and then a third. They were human machine guns. Narrator. V.O. The French nobility were being systematically cut down. Arrogance turned to shock, and shock was quickly turning to blind, furious rage. Goaded beyond endurance by the arrow storm, the French front line began its ponderous advance. They began the long, terrible walk across the field of Agincourt. Every step was a battle against the ground itself. The advance slowed to a crawl. They were draining their strength long before they even reached the English line. The English archers did not relent. The cavalry charge failed completely, broken not just by arrows, but by the impenetrable hedge of sharpened stakes. The French vanguard was now a disorganized, exhausted, and bleeding mob. The earth itself seemed to be drinking the life from the French army. Finally, the first French soldiers reached the English line. They were breathless. They were exhausted. Their initial charge had lost all its force. The two lines locked together in a brutal, close-quarters struggle. The French were at a terrible disadvantage, tightly packed. They could not even raise their arms properly. This was the moment the English longbowmen had been waiting for. Having fired their last arrows, they abandoned their bows. This lightness now became their greatest asset. While the French knights floundered in the mud, the archers were able to move freely. They darted out, swarming around the bogged-down French men-at-arms. The slaughter was horrific. The archers attacked from the side and the rear. Once a knight was down in the mud, his heavy armor became his tomb. The battle had devolved into a brutal, one-sided massacre. The press of bodies was so immense that men were suffocated where they stood, pressed deep into blood-soaked mud. A terrible, ghastly mound began to form. It became a rampart, a wall of men that blocked the French advance. The second wave of knights had to clamber over that slippery, shifting pile. The ghastly climb drained their energy and broke their spirits. English men-at-arms simply held the line. They killed the exhausted men who spilled over the top. The fight was no longer a battle. It was butchery. Men in the second line watched in horror. They saw the mountain of their dead growing higher. Panic rippled through the ranks. In the midst of the swirling chaos, King Henry V was not a distant commander. He was in the thick of the fight. The battle reached a moment of supreme crisis when the Duke of Alençon cut their way through to Henry's position. Alençon's axe blow struck Henry's helmet, but Henry's royal guard surged forward to defend him. The brave Duke was struck down. He was killed before Henry could intervene. The English roared their defiance and fought with renewed, vengeful fury. The counterattack was the final straw. What was left of the French vanguard broke completely, the men throwing down their weapons and trying to flee. The battle was not quite over. A new threat emerged. The French third line lingered. At the same time, a local French lord led a raid on the lightly defended English baggage train. And they had a new problem: prisoners. They were armed warriors who now outnumbered their English guards. If the French third line decided to attack, these prisoners could easily rearm themselves. Henry V was faced with a terrible, ice-cold calculation.
Kill the prisoners. He gave a chilling order: kill the prisoners. At first, his own knights refused. They would not be party to such a cold-blooded massacre.
Henry was ruthless. He commanded a company of archers. They moved through the prisoner groups. It was a horrific, bloody business, but it was decisive. As the last echoes of battle faded, a stunned silence fell. The ground was carpeted with the dead. The French losses were catastrophic. Thousands lay dead. An entire generation of France's military and political leadership was gone. Henry V walked the field of his incredible victory. The herald replied, "Agincourt." Henry declared that this battle would forever be known as the Battle of Agincourt. The small, battered English army resumed its march to Calais. They were no longer desperate fugitives, but a column of triumphant heroes. When Henry and his army finally landed at Dover, they were greeted as legends. Their impossible triumph was seen as proof God was on the English side. The Battle of Agincourt did not end the 100 Years' War, but it changed its course forever. The victory at Agincourt directly financed his next invasion of France. This vulnerability allowed Henry V to achieve what had seemed impossible. He forced the French king to sign the Treaty of Troyes and named Henry and his heirs as successors to the throne of France. Agincourt's legacy is most powerful as a story. It was immortalized by William Shakespeare. The St. Crispin's Day speech has resonated through the centuries. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. This was Agincourt, England's greatest victory. The peak of medieval chivalry drowned in a sea of mud, brought low by the skill and ferocity of common soldiers. Subscribe for more epic history battles every week.